The screen flickers with a grainy black and white image of a heavy steel door slamming shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Then, a whisper barely audible over the static. If you are seeing this, the protocol has already failed. The year was 1964. Deep within the mist-shrouded Appalachian Mountains, a facility existed officially designated as a geological research center. To locals, it was just a government outpost. But the truth was buried deeper. The facility was a concrete tomb for identity, where the air smelled of industrial bleach and ozone. Dr. Arthur Vance arrived on a cold October morning. A brilliant psychologist, Vance had been recruited under the guise of national defense. He was told he would lead Project Lethe, a classified initiative to help soldiers overcome combat trauma. To Vance, it was a noble calling. He imagined himself curing the nightmares of men who had seen too much. However, the reality behind the reinforced steel doors was far from therapeutic. As he was ushered through the sterile corridors by silent guards, he met Colonel Graves. Graves was a man of sharp angles who viewed the human mind not as a sanctuary, but as a tactical obstacle. Graves spoke of optimization and efficiency, terms that felt chillingly out of place. The volunteers arrived in the dead of night. They were men the world had forgotten, soldiers with no kin, political dissidents, and the homeless. They were told they were receiving experimental therapy. Instead, they were stripped of their clothes, their possessions, and their names. The methods were designed to dismantle the human spirit. In the adjustment wings, subjects were exposed to high-frequency white noise 24 hours a day. Strobe lights pulsed in mathematical sequences to disrupt the brain's natural rhythms. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This bombardment broke the circadian rhythm, detaching subjects from time until the past and future bled into confusion. Dr. Vance initially believed these were harsh first steps of a radical treatment, but the first red flag appeared 2 weeks in. While reviewing logs, he noticed unauthorized chemical injections administered by military handlers at night. These weren't sedatives he had approved, they were experimental compounds that left the subjects in catatonic suggestibility. When he confronted Graves, the colonel reminded him that national interest required liberties. Soon, a terrifying psychological shift took hold. The subjects stopped asking for their families or praying. In the holding areas, they no longer spoke in sentences. Instead, they began to recite long, rhythmic strings of numerical code in perfect, haunting unison. It was as if their personalities were being overwritten by a collective operating system. The atmosphere grew heavy with clinical horror. Human dignity was being systematically stripped away. The sterile environment hummed with an unnatural energy. Every corridor looked identical, painted in a flat, sickening gray that seemed to absorb light. The guards never spoke, and the doctors who worked under Vance moved with a robotic precision that suggested they, too, might be part of the experiment. Vance began to feel the walls closing in, the isolation of the mountains mirroring the isolation of his own increasingly fractured conscience. He spent his nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if the white noise was leaking into his own quarters. One evening, while searching for a misplaced file, Vance's hand brushed a concealed latch in his mahogany desk. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside sat a weathered leather ledger. As he turned the pages, his blood froze in his veins. It contained a list of disposed assets, names of men who had been processed and removed. The most terrifying part was not the list, but the dates. These disposals occurred months before Project Lethe had officially begun. Vance realized then that he was not an innovator, but a silent witness to a dark crime that had already claimed dozens of lives and the very soul of everyone in this vast, cursed facility. The horror shifted from the mind to the marrow. As November's frost gripped the Appalachians, Lethe entered its most predatory phase. Dr. Vance watched through reinforced observation glass as the clinical masks of the surgical team descended upon the subjects. They were no longer just rewriting memories. They were remapping the complex biological architecture of the brain. These procedures were conducted without the mercy of anesthesia, under the cold justification that the subjects needed to be fully conscious to report the sensations as their neural pathways were cauterized. They called it mapping the centers of fear, finding the exact topographical coordinates of a man's soul and turning them into a control panel for external manipulation. Among the subjects, one stood out as a terrifying success. Subject 731, formerly known as Elias, a veteran whose eyes had lost their color, turning a milky, translucent white. Elias showed physical anomalies that defied medical explanation. His skin grew thin, almost parchment-like, and his ears seemed to twitch in response to frequencies the human ear shouldn't be able to detect. To push him further, the military handlers placed him in a pressurized saltwater tank. For weeks, Elias floated in total darkness, his only connection being the IV drips feeding him a cocktail of stimulants and the underwater speakers that played distorted, slowed-down recordings of his own voice screaming for his long-dead mother. The goal was to dissolve the boundary between identity and the void, leaving only a hollow vessel that could be filled with external instructions. The true danger manifested during a routine cognitive response test. Elias was seated in the center of a soundproof chamber when Graves ordered a high-intensity visual stimulus. As the lights flashed, Elias didn't scream. Instead, he opened his mouth and emitted a frequency that hummed in the bones of everyone present. The reinforced glass of the observation room suddenly spiderwebbed with cracks before shattering into 1,000 shards. Guards collapsed to the floor, clutching their heads as blood leaked from their ears, their bodies racked by violent seizures. In that moment, Vance saw the raw power they were unearthing. It wasn't healing. It was the creation of a living, breathing acoustic weapon. Arthur Vance felt a cold realization settle in his chest. He was no longer a doctor. He was now a high-functioning executioner presiding over a slaughterhouse of the human spirit. When he tried to halt the next series of surgeries, he found his access codes revoked. The cameras in the hallways followed his every single movement. He was no longer the director of the project. He was another variable being monitored constantly. Digging through encrypted files, he discovered the ultimate objective. The government didn't want cured soldiers. They wanted human triggers, remotely activated biological weapons that could be deployed, triggered to cause chaos, and then discarded without a trace. The tension reached a breaking point during a massive containment breach. One of the subjects, a man whose identity had been completely erased, managed to override his cell's magnetic lock, but he didn't run for the exit. Vance found him in the dimly lit hallway, slumped against the wall. The man had used his own fingernails to claw his eyes out, whispering through bloodied lips that he had to stop the signals. The sheer desperation was a testament to the agony the project had inflicted. Colonel Graves arrived shortly after, stepping over the dying man. He turned to Vance and calmly informed him that the dataset was now complete. The final solution for the project had been approved. There was no room for negotiation in Graves's eyes. The colonel made it clear that the evidence, the subjects, the files, and the witnesses were liabilities. Suddenly, the sterile silence was shattered by sirens. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors in a rhythmic pulse. "Cleanup Protocol Alpha has been initiated," the automated voice echoed. Vance looked at the monitor as the perimeter gates locked. The lethal protocol meant total physical erasure. No one was permitted to leave alive. The destruction was not a chaotic collapse, but a surgical erasure, a symphony of fire. Panic filled the sterile hallways, yet it was a cold, organized panic directed by shadows. While the sirens wailed their mournful warnings, the roar of industrial incinerators became the facility's new heartbeat. Dr. Arthur Vance watched from a sub-level corridor as soldiers tossed reams of paper, names, faces, medical histories, into the orange maws of the furnaces. Notes documenting a man's descent into madness became anonymous gray ash. Everything that made these subjects human was being systematically deleted. In the holding barracks, the volunteers were being rounded up. They were told it was a routine decontamination before transport to a new facility. Vance saw Elias, subject 731, being led toward the showers, his milky eyes staring at nothing, his body vibrating with that low subsonic hum that now felt like a curse. The decontamination room was a final, hideous lie. As the heavy steel doors hissed shut, Vance knew no water would flow from those tarnished nozzles. Instead, a colorless, odorless gas would seep from the vents, turning the room into a silent, airless tomb for the forgotten. He could almost feel the phantom pressure in his own lungs as he watched the light in the hallway flicker. He couldn't let it end like this. He broke into his private office, his hands shaking as he retrieved a small canister of microfilm from a hidden cavity in the floor. The only physical evidence of the atrocities committed in the name of national defense. He had to get to Elias. He rushed toward the lower maintenance tunnels, avoiding squads of soldiers rigging the structural pillars with C4. He managed to intercept the transport line near the showers just as the gas began its lethal hiss. With a stolen security key, he dragged a semi-conscious Elias through an emergency hatch. The young veteran was cold, his skin nearly translucent, revealing the pulsing blue veins that mapped his suffering. Together, they stumbled through the dark service shafts toward the surface, the smell of ozone and death clinging to their clothes. Emerging onto the helipad, the frigid Appalachian air hit Vance like a physical blow. But the escape was an illusion. Standing by the idling Huey helicopter was Colonel Graves, his long coat fluttering in the rotor wash. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply stood there with a thin, predatory smile. Vance held up the microfilm canister, screaming over the engine roar that the world would know the truth. Graves stepped closer, his voice cutting through the noise with chilling clarity. He revealed the final, cruelest twist. The microfilm was a plant. It contained nothing but gibberish designed to implicate Vance as the sole architect of the horrors. The cleanup wasn't just about the subjects. It was the final stage of Vance's own conditioning, a test to see if a man of science would choose truth or survival. "You were always a subject, Arthur," Graves shouted, his eyes reflecting the cold moonlight. "A study in the limits of the intellectual conscience." Before Vance could react, the first charges detonated deep within the mountain's belly. The ground buckled. Graves boarded the helicopter, leaving Vance and the dying Elias on the cracking concrete. Minutes later, a massive accidental gas explosion leveled the site, the mountain swallowing the facility. Within weeks, the National Forest Service arrived to pour thousands of tons of concrete into the smoking crater, sealing the secrets under a gray, vast, impenetrable shroud. Decades passed, and the forest reclaimed the surface, but the townspeople in the valleys below still report strange lights and a persistent low-frequency humming that vibrates in the earth. FOIA requests regarding Operation Lethe return only hundreds of pages of thick black ink, the ultimate monument to state-sponsored amnesia. Modern psychology was built on the broken bodies of those who never had a choice. If this was the price of progress in 1964, what are they building? We won't find out for another 50 years.